Guadalcanal. Night presses down like a hand over the jungle. It is August 1942 and the rain comes in sheets, hammering canvas and palm leaves, turning foxholes into brown wells. The air smells of rot and cordite, of sweat that never dries. Mosquitoes rise in clouds from the stagnant puddles, singing around bare skin, probing for blood. Under a sagging poncho, by the faint red glow of a hooded flashlight, a young American corpsman kneels beside a Marine who will not stop bleeding. A jagged fragment has torn into the man's thigh. His hands shake, but his movements are practiced. Sulfa powder, field dressing, morphine syrup between the teeth, a bottle of reconstituted plasma hanging from a rifle propped in the mud, the pale fluid dripping slowly into a vein. 50 yards away, beyond the tree line, Japanese soldiers lie shivering in the dark, fevers burning in their skulls. Malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers eating into flesh. Their officers had promised that the jungle itself would fight for them, that white men would wither here. Yet on this island, in this storm, one wounded American's odds of survival may be better than any soldier in history. In the summer of 1942, the Pacific War was still very young, and the map told a simple, terrifying story. From the beaches of Malaya to the jungles of New Guinea, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, Japan's rising sun flag had spread with astonishing speed. In less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Allied strongholds that Europeans had assumed were impregnable had collapsed. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, had fallen in February. American and Filipino troops on Bataan surrendered in April, and Corregidor went soon after. The Dutch East Indies, with its vital oil, had been overrun. At every turn, the jungle and the climate seemed to move with the Japanese. In Malaya, British and Indian troops bogged down on roads, while Japanese columns slipped through rubber plantations and swamp, bypassing strongpoints, infiltrating along bicycle tracks and jungle paths. In Burma, retreating British and Chinese forces were not only beaten by maneuver, but by heat exhaustion, dysentery, and malaria. In New Guinea, Australian patrols reported whole units weakened by fever before they had even found the enemy. To Japanese planners, this felt like confirmation of something they had believed long before the first shot was fired, that the tropics would favor them. Pre-war Japanese military thinking carried a strong current of racial and environmental confidence. Many officers were convinced that Westerners were physically and mentally unsuited to prolonged operations in heat and humidity. Asian soldiers, they believed, hardened by poverty and accustomed to harsh climates, would endure jungle hardship that would break softer, industrialized societies. In staff studies and war games, disease and climate were treated not just as obstacles, but as multipliers of Japanese strength. The geography of the coming war seemed to support that view. The Central and Southwest Pacific were dotted with islands cloaked in dense vegetation, fringed by swamps, cut by rivers that turned chocolate brown after every rain. Inland mountains rose steep and abrupt from the sea, covered with rainforest and kunai grass, their slopes slick with clinging mud. The air in places like New Guinea or the Solomons did not just feel hot, it felt heavy, loaded with moisture and the smell of decay. Invisible in that air were the real killers, parasites and microbes that had preyed on armies for centuries. Malaria, carried by the Anopheles mosquito, could clear a battalion's fighting strength in weeks. Dengue fever, scrub typhus, and yellow fever thrust men into cycles of fever and agony. Dysentery and other diarrheal diseases, spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation, sapped weight and will. Hookworm, roundworm, and a host of other parasites burrowed into bare feet and unprotected skin. Beriberi crept up when rice was polished too clean, stripping away vitamins. History's graphs were clear. In colonial campaigns in the Spanish-American War, even in many fronts of the First World War, more soldiers had died of disease than from enemy bullets. The jungle did not need rifles. The Japanese Army and Navy medical departments understood some of this. Japan had fought in Manchuria and China, had garrisons in Taiwan, Korea, and the mandated islands of Micronesia. There were tropical medicine specialists in Tokyo and quinine stocks for malaria. But the scale of preparation did not match the scale of ambition. Japan went to war with a strained industrial base and limited access to the chemical and pharmaceutical industries that underpinned modern medicine. Quinine came largely from cinchona plantations in the Dutch East Indies. Synthetic substitutes like atabrine required sophisticated production. Shipping was scarce and contested. In that competition for tonnage, ammunition and aviation fuel usually beat mosquito nets and medical stores. Doctrine and culture filled in the gaps. Endurance, or gammon, was held up as a virtue. Officers and men were taught that spiritual strength and willpower could overcome physical weakness. Evacuation of the sick and wounded in prolonged jungle campaigns was often not planned in detail because operations were assumed to be decisive and quick. In some army formations, to fall gravely ill was to slide toward irrelevance, even shame. Across the ocean, the American military was hardly better prepared at first for the particular cruelty of the Pacific environment. The U.S. Army's interwar years had focused on mechanization, on the lessons of the Western Front, artillery barrages, trench stalemates, chemical weapons that had been forbidden but not forgot. The Navy had thought in terms of carriers and battleships, fleet engagements on the open sea. Even in the Philippines, where American forces had decades of colonial experience, tropical medicine knowledge had not fully translated into a mass, war-ready system. The early campaigns showed the cost. On Bataan, American and Filipino troops were hammered by malaria and dysentery as much as by Japanese artillery. Quinine was in short supply. Men stood in chow lines with fevers only to collapse. In the first months on Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines and later soldiers lived on half rations of canned meat and hard biscuits, drinking from streams tainted by upstream latrines. Mosquito nets were often useless in the rain-smashed foxholes. By the time the island was secured, an overwhelming proportion of the troops who had served there had contracted malaria at least once. In New Guinea, Australian veterans of the brutal Kokoda track fighting remembered entire companies reduced to a handful of effective men, the rest shivering under blankets, eyes yellowed, muscles trembling with each fever spike. The terrain made movement slow and resupply erratic. Litter teams slipped and fell in the mud, sometimes taking hours to move a single casualty a few hundred yards. Japanese intelligence analysts watched these developments closely. Reports filtered back from the Solomons and New Guinea of American and Australian units with alarming non-battle casualty rates. Interrogations of prisoners, intercepted communications, and battlefield observations seemed to confirm what many had predicted. The white enemy was faltering in the tropics, even when not under direct fire. In Tokyo and in forward headquarters, it was tempting to see in these statistics a silent ally. If disease and jungle could be relied upon to thin out any landing force, to erode strength between battles, then shortages in Japanese material and logistics might be partly offset. The war could be run on a narrower margin. The enemy would be worn down by nature itself. But beneath the surface of these early setbacks, far from the front lines, something was beginning to stir inside the American war effort, not a new weapon in the conventional sense, but a decision to treat medicine, logistics, and science as instruments of strategy. The decision to treat medicine, logistics, and science as instruments of strategy did not emerge from nowhere. It grew out of a long, bloody memory. For most of recorded history, generals had lost more men to water and insects than to rifles and artillery. In the American Civil War, in colonial campaigns in Africa and Asia, even in parts of the First World War, disease had been the real reaper. Doctors understood germs. They understood something of sanitation. But they had little to fight infection with, and almost nothing to stop the invisible armies of parasites in the tropics. World War I had pushed medicine forward. Surgeons learned to debride wounds, to remove dead tissue before it festered. Antiseptics like iodine and carbolic acid were refined. Blood transfusion techniques were pioneered, crude but effective. The U.S. Army Medical Department and Navy Bureau of Medicine and Surgery came out of that war with more authority, more experience, and a sense that science could bend the casualty curve. Yet the critical tools were still missing. There were no true antibiotics. Malaria was controlled, if at all, by quinine and by discipline. Typhoid and some other diseases had vaccines, but a single infected wound could still turn septic and kill a man the shells had only wounded. Between the wars, civilian laboratories began to change that. In the 1930s, German researchers discovered the first of the sulfonamide drugs. Prontosol and later its derivatives showed a remarkable ability to halt certain bacterial infections. American and British chemists picked up the thread. By the late 1930s, sulfa powders and tablets were emerging from factories, promising to turn the tide against wound infections and pneumonia. At the same time, scattered work on a mysterious mold-derived substance called penicillin was underway, though still far from mass use. The United States had another, quieter advantage: decades of experience in tropical medicine through its presence in places like the Philippines and the Panama Canal Zone. American doctors and public health officers had helped drive yellow fever and malaria out of the canal area by draining swamps, screening windows, and attacking mosquitoes. The U.S. Public Health Service and organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation funded research on vector-borne diseases. By 1941, American medical literature contained a wealth of knowledge on how malaria spread and how it could be contained. What it lacked was a mechanism to apply that knowledge at scale under fire. Pearl Harbor and the subsequent disasters changed that rapidly. Almost overnight, the U.S. government elevated scientists and physicians to the level of strategic partners. The Office of Scientific Research and Development under Vannevar Bush coordinated hundreds of research programs. The War Department and Navy signed contracts with universities and pharmaceutical companies. War was no longer just an affair of guns and ships, it became a national laboratory. Malaria stood at the center of this laboratory's Pacific focus. With the Japanese seizure of the Dutch East Indies access to cinchona plantations, the source of natural quinine was cut off. Quinine stocks dwindled. The United States had to lean hard on a synthetic substitute that had been developed earlier but used reluctantly, Atabrine. Atabrine had side effects. It could cause nausea, diarrhea, and a yellowish stain to the skin that some soldiers hated. Rumors spread that it caused sterility, but in clinical tests it suppressed malaria attacks. American industry went to work producing it by the ton. Military directives began to insist that troops in malarious zones take the bitter, chalky tablets on a strict schedule. Malaria control units were organized to spray breeding sites, distribute nets, and enforce discipline. In parallel, the problem of blood and fluids was attacked. During World War I, transfusions had required donor and recipient to be side by side, or blood had to be used quickly before it spoiled. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, researchers in the United States and Britain, including figures like Dr. Charles Drew, refined the techniques of blood banking. They learned to separate plasma, the clear liquid that carries cells, from red blood cells and to preserve it. Dried plasma, sealed in bottles or tins, could be stored without refrigeration, then reconstituted with sterile water close to the front. It would not carry oxygen like red cells, but it could restore volume, raise blood pressure, and pull a man out of shock. That one innovation, married to sulfa drugs and better surgery, would save countless lives in the jungles of the Pacific. Around these new tools, a structure grew. Medical training programs expanded at a furious pace. Young men who might once have become orderlies now went through intensive courses as medics and Navy corpsmen. They learned how to apply tourniquets, pack wounds, inject morphine, start plasma, and recognize malaria, dysentery, and heat stroke. Army hospitals practiced setting up under canvas. Surgical teams drilled in operating quickly, doing just enough in the forward area to keep a man alive for evacuation. The evacuation system itself was redesigned. In the interwar years, some forward thinkers had experimented with air evacuation in the United States and its territories. Now that concept would be pushed into the remotest corners of the Pacific. Light aircraft, C-47 transports, and even seaplanes would be used to carry wounded men away from muddy airstrips and coral beaches to better-equipped rear hospitals. Hospital ships, painted white with red crosses, were assigned to follow major amphibious operations. All of this required a huge commitment of shipping, fuel, manpower, and industrial capacity. It reflected a very specific view of the soldier as an asset whose survival had strategic value, whose return to duty justified enormous effort. On the Japanese side, there were talented doctors and dedicated medics as well. Japan had its own research institutes, some of them engaged in horrific and unethical experiments that would later shock the world. But the fruits of whatever knowledge was gained rarely reached the ordinary infantryman shivering in a New Guinea ravine. Japan lacked the sprawling chemical industry needed to flood its armies with synthetic antimalarials or sulfa drugs. Shipping space was limited, and under increasing threat from Allied submarines and aircraft, High Command often chose bullets and rice over plasma and quinine. Field units went into long campaigns with slender medical reserves and vague evacuation plans, buoyed by belief in spirit and endurance. By 1943, two very different medical machines were taking shape. One was industrial, data-driven, and increasingly ruthless about enforcing health discipline on its own troops. The other was austere, stretched, and anchored in a culture that praised suffering more than it funded prevention. Soon they would be tested on the same ridges, swamps, and beaches, places where a man's fate would hang, not only on who held the high ground, but on how fast help could reach him once he fell. Inside operations rooms and field headquarters, the jungle war was reduced to numbers. Staff officers spread charts and strength returns over wooden tables, calculating how many men a regiment could put on the line. 2 columns always ran alongside the tally of killed and wounded in combat, sick and non-effective. In the first New Guinea campaigns, those columns could dwarf the others. For every man hit by a bullet or shell, several more could be lost at least temporarily to malaria, dysentery, or some other debilitating illness. American commanders learned fast that a unit could lose its fighting edge without ever being decisively beaten in battle. Companies arrived at the front with 100 men, only to find that within weeks, a third were on sick reports. On Guadalcanal, Army and Marine leaders watched their battalions bleed strength to fever and exhaustion as much as to Japanese fire. The lesson was brutal and clear. If disease ran unchecked, it could make victory on the map meaningless. Japanese planners had entered the war expecting exactly that effect on their enemies. Staff studies before 1941 had assumed heavy disease losses for any invading force operating far from its base over fragile supply lines, in climates it did not understand. Japanese troops they believed would suffer too, but less. The environment would act as an unseen ally. What they did not fully anticipate was how rapidly the United States would turn those grim columns on the report sheets into a strategic target, to be attacked with the same rigor as an enemy division. The counterattack began in laboratories and factories hundreds of miles from any swamp. American chemists translated the new sulfonamide discoveries into mass-produced powders and tablets. Cases of sulfa became as essential to units' loadout as ammunition. Doctors learned that dusting a torn, dirty wound with the bitter powder, then closing it quickly, could slash the rate of fatal infections. Pneumonia, once a frequent killer in crowded camps and ship holds, could often be blunted before it turned lethal. Atabrine factories ran around the clock, turning out millions of the yellow tablets that men loved to hate. Orders went out from theater commanders. In malarial zones, every soldier would take his dose, whether he believed in it or not. Malaria control units mixed entomology with engineering, analyzing breeding sites, draining puddles where possible, and spraying insecticides where not. They handed out mosquito nets and taught men how to tuck them properly, a small, tedious ritual that might mean the difference between a week of high fever and staying in the line. On the surgical side, field teams refined a brutal efficiency. Their goal was not to perform delicate reconstructions in tents, it was to keep men alive long enough to reach those who could. Dried plasma kits gave them a way to fight shock. Medics could hang the brown bottle from a convenient branch or rifle, prick a vein, and watch as a man's ashen face slowly regained some color. The combination of sulfa, plasma, and rapid debridement of wounds created a chain of survival that simply had not existed a generation earlier. Time became the most precious commodity. Quietly, doctrine shifted to recognize that the first hour after wounding, the speed of that first intervention, could decide whether a man would live to see the inside of a hospital ship. Though no one yet used the later phrase golden hour, the idea was there, shaping logistics and tactics alike. At the end of that chain, kneeling in the mud or sand beside the fallen, stood a new kind of frontline figure, the combat medic and the Navy corpsman. They went into battle with no rifle, or with one slung uselessly across their back, their hands full of something else. Bandage rolls and compresses, tourniquets to cinch tight above mangled limbs, ampules of morphine in glass tubes slipped into pocket loops against accidental breakage, each dose logged later with care. Little tins of sulfa to be poured like lifeline dust into wounds pulsing with every heartbeat. Rubber tubing and needles, the beginnings of a transfusion set or a plasma line. Their training was hurried but intensive. They learned how to crawl under fire without jostling a shattered femur, how to distinguish arterial from venous bleeding in the flicker of a flashlight under a poncho, how to recognize the glassy stare of a man sliding into shock or the flushed, sweating confusion of heat stroke. They practiced tying splints from branches and rifle slings, improvising stretchers from shelter halves and poles. In the jungle, they often worked half-blind. On Bougainville or in the interior of New Guinea, a medic might follow only the faint cries of corpsman, or medic, through a tangle of vines and roots, feeling for a boot or a hand in the undergrowth. Japanese snipers learned to target the red crosses on helmets and bags, forcing many medics to strip their insignia and accept even greater personal risk. Yet word spread through the ranks, if you were hit, someone would come, someone with more than a bandana and a prayer. That knowledge changed how men faced the jungle. Terror did not vanish, but it was balanced by a grim confidence that if you could just stay conscious, just keep calling, a pair of hands might press into the earth beside you and start working. To understand fully what these men were fighting against, and what made their work so extraordinary, you have to look more closely at the environment itself, and at the very different ways the American and Japanese armies chose to confront, or simply endure, the jungle. For the men on the ground, the jungle was not an abstraction. It was a living, indifferent presence that pressed in on every side. On Guadalcanal, patrols stepped off before dawn into elephant grass taller than a man, soaked through before they had gone 100 yards. Shirts and trousers never truly dried. Skin softened and cracked. In New Guinea, the kunai grass cut at bare arms like knives, and the air along the coastal swamps hung thick with the smell of stagnant water and decaying plants. Leeches clung to ankles and calves. Feet, trapped in wet boots day after day, whitened and blistered, then split. Every puddle was a potential breeding ground. Every unboiled sip from a tempting stream carried a hidden cost. At first, American units treated many of these hazards as inconveniences rather than mortal threats. Men skipped the chore of digging proper latrines and wandered off into the trees. Waste seeped into watercourses. Food scraps were left out, drawing flies. Shirts were shed in the heat, offering more inviting skin for mosquitoes. Malaria and dysentery surged. Then came orders and enforcement. Malaria control details tramped through the same mud, this time with sprayers, shovels, and ledgers. They mapped stagnant pools and, when possible, drained them, where they could not. They sprayed insecticides, a forerunner of the later DDT campaigns. They passed out bed nets and made sure they were used. Men grumbled when told to wear sleeves down and leggings up in suffocating heat, but the pattern of bites on their arms and legs could be counted, measured, tracked. In places like Bougainville, entire lectures were given before operations about boiling water, the exact depth and placement of slit trenches, the necessity of swallowing every Adabrin tablet handed out. Officers were told plainly, units with weak discipline on these points would lose combat power regardless of bravery. On the Japanese side of the same ridge or river, the picture often looked different. Japanese infantry marched with lighter packs, carrying less in the way of personal gear, including fewer changes of clothes, fewer socks, and often no spare footwear. Mosquito nets were scarcer and sometimes abandoned to save weight. In New Guinea's Finistero Range, medical researchers later found entire Japanese positions where nearly every man carried the parasite for malaria. Many also bore hookworm, their strength draining away with each day. The Imperial Japanese Army had medical units, but they were fewer relative to troop strength and less generously supplied. Field hygiene was advocated in manuals, but the crush of operations, poor logistics, and the belief that soldiers should simply endure often overrode it. Water discipline faltered when units were cut off and thirsty. Food already short was sometimes eaten undercooked. Insects swarmed latrines left too close to living areas or streams. The contrast was stark by 1943 and 1944. In parts of New Guinea and the Solomons, Allied sickness rates, though still serious, began to curve downward as malaria control, Adabrin regimens, and improved sanitation took hold. Japanese sickness rates, by contrast, rose and stayed high. On bypassed islands and in isolated jungle pockets, some Japanese garrisons saw disease and starvation claim far more lives than artillery or bombs ever did. Culture and doctrine lay at the heart of that divergence. In both armies, there were doctors and medics who fought for their patients, but in the Japanese system, they were working against a tide. The Imperial Army had gone into the war built for sharp, short campaigns on the Asian mainland. Its supply system was fragile, its shipping thin. When operations dragged on in distant jungles, the whole structure bent. Evacuating large numbers of sick or wounded men required ships and aircraft that did not exist in enough numbers and would have been vulnerable to Allied attack if they had. Plans for protracted medical care far behind the lines were often sketchy. The ethos fed into this. Soldiers were taught that true warriors did not expect to return. Sickness could be seen as a personal failing. Even when orders did not explicitly condemn evacuation, the stigma lingered. On the Owen Stanley track through New Guinea's spine, Australian troops saw the results. Japanese soldiers too weak to march sat by the trail, propped against trees, left with a little rice and water to meet whatever came. In later campaigns on islands bypassed by the American advance, entire garrisons wasted slowly, their medical officers doing what they could with herbal remedies and dwindling tablets, but watching diseases they knew how to name and diagnose run unchecked. American troops, too, suffered in these environments. There were instances of men shirking Adabrin because of rumors about sterility, of latrine discipline breaking down under shellfire, of supply shortages leading to contaminated water. But at higher levels, senior Allied commanders came to regard non-battle casualties as something that could and must be controlled. Reports on malaria incidents found their way to theater headquarters. In some commands, officers were relieved not for losing battles, but for failing to enforce health measures. This revealed a deeper moral distinction in how each side valued the individual soldier, and how that value translated into action. For the U.S. military, the decision to pour enormous industrial and logistical resources into medical support was not purely humanitarian. A wounded or sick man who could be brought back to health represented months or years of training preserved, a rifle kept in the field, experience retained. Yet that cold calculus was underpinned by a broader cultural expectation that the state owed something to its citizens in uniform, not invulnerability but a genuine attempt at rescue and care. This expectation pulled ships off other duties to serve as floating hospitals. It sent C-47 transports into rough jungle airstrips just to pick up stretcher cases. It justified fleets of ambulances and convoys of medical supplies pushing up into the mud. It meant that when a man fell, his comrades could believe someone somewhere had planned for what happened next. For Japanese soldiers, the implicit contract was narrower. The state demanded sacrifice. In return, it offered honor but not necessarily a path home. The rhetoric of the time glorified the soldier who died in battle or who, trapped, chose suicide over capture. Medical support that could not be provided without weakening the offensive was often sacrificed. Non-battle deaths were mourned but also accepted as part of a harsh natural order. The effect on morale accumulated quietly. In American units, stories spread of men hit badly in the jungle who nonetheless survived, of the corpsman who crawled through fire, of the swift jeep ride to a battalion aid station, of the white hull of a hospital ship glimpsed from a litter as it swung aboard. These stories reinforced trust not only in the medics but in the system around them. In many Japanese formations, by contrast, the stories were of comrades who had simply disappeared into the trees, too weak to keep up, or of hospitals stripped bare of drugs, or of ships sunk with wounded packed aboard them, no red crosses on their sides. Such tales did not erase courage, but they eroded the sense that endurance would be met with anything but more suffering. Layered over the mud and foliage, then, there was an invisible contest of values and structures. On one side, an emerging belief that preserving life, even in war, was itself a form of strength. On the other, an older conviction that victory and sacrifice could be weighed more heavily than the survival of the individual. The ultimate test of these choices came not in theory, but in the campaigns where both armies hurled themselves into the same killing grounds, only to discover that bullets and bayonets were only part of the story. The ultimate test of these choices came not in staff studies, but on raw, unfamiliar ground. It arrived on a narrow strip of coral and jungle that few Americans had heard of when the war began, Guadalcanal. On 7 August 1942, the 1st Marine Division came ashore under gray skies and the roar of naval guns. Their objective was a half-finished Japanese airfield near a sluggish river called the Lunga. The maps were poor. The climate, many assumed, would simply be another discomfort like dust or cold in other theaters. Within weeks, the island proved them wrong. Heat and humidity wrapped themselves around every movement. Night brought no relief, only darkness and the high, insistent whine of mosquitoes. Foxholes filled with water. Rations, already short after the U.S. Navy pulled back in the face of Japanese attacks, spoiled in the heat or were eaten half frozen out of cans. Men lived on captured Japanese rice and what could be scrounged. The first cases of malaria were almost dismissed as bad colds or simple exhaustion. Then the numbers climbed. Medical officers on Guadalcanal watched their sick reports swell with entries marked fever of undetermined origin, malaria suspected. Men whose names had been on the morning roll were huddled under blankets by evening, teeth chattering in the tropical night, skin hot to the touch. Dysentery spread through units whose latrines had been dug too shallow, too close to camps and water points under the pressure of bombardment. By the time the 1st Marine Division was relieved in late 1942, thousands of its men had been incapacitated by malaria at least once. Some estimates put the rate of infection so high that only a small fraction had escaped the parasite entirely. One senior officer would later describe malaria, not the Japanese, as the division's most implacable enemy. But across the same island, Japanese infantry were sinking even deeper into the same swamp of disease. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were supplied erratically by fast destroyers in night runs the Americans called the Tokyo Express. Those ships could bring in shells and men, but not the tonnage of food and medicine that a sustained campaign demanded. As the months passed, photographs and diary entries revealed soldiers so thin their uniforms hung off them like loose sacks. Dysentery and tropical ulcers riddled their ranks. Malaria, unchecked by widespread quinine or synthetic drugs, burned through units rotated in from other islands. Assaults on the American perimeter were often launched by men already weakened, men who had marched for days on little more than a handful of rice. Those who fell wounded had few chances of rescue. Under the canopy, Japanese stretcher teams fought mud and roots just as their American counterparts did, but they had fewer aid stations to aim for, fewer drugs waiting at the end. On the American side, the brutal lesson of those months was absorbed quickly. Navy and Army medical officers in the South Pacific collected data from Guadalcanal and the surrounding islands. Tables of non-effective days due to malaria and other diseases circulated alongside after-action reports on firefights and bombardments. Admiral William Halsey's command concluded that if nothing changed, disease would cripple offensive power in the Solomons. Change followed. Atabrine discipline, haphazard at first, became an enforced routine. In some units, tablets were issued under direct supervision, men required to swallow them in front of their officers. Bed nets, once seen as optional, were made mandatory in bivouacs away from the firing line. Malaria control units arrived with sprayers and larvicides. They walked the perimeters, knotting stagnant pools, clogged drainage ditches, and discarded containers where water collected and mosquitoes bred. On neighboring islands in the Solomons chain, Tulagi, Florida, New Georgia, the same pattern played out but with an increasingly organized American response. Units rotated through rest areas where medical staffs pushed atabrine, treated chronic infections, and tried to build up men's strength before sending them back forward. The jungle still bit deep, but now there was a plan to blunt its teeth. Meanwhile, farther west, a different, more grinding ordeal was unfolding in New Guinea. There, the war was fought along a thin coastal strip of swamp and mangrove, and up steep, mist-strapped ridges where trails were little more than muddy scars across the mountains. Australian troops had already fought the Japanese along the Kokoda Track in 1942, losing many more men to sickness and exhaustion than to direct fire. When American units entered the campaign in force around Buna and Gona later that year, they stepped into the same crucible. The terrain around Buna was a nightmare for evacuation and supply alike. Monsoon rains turned the ground to a soup of mud and stagnant water. Palm groves and kunai grass concealed not just bunkers and machine gun nests, but breeding grounds for every insect and microbe the tropics could muster. American troops, often inexperienced in such conditions, tried to advance in wool uniforms and standard boots, sweating, slipping, and drinking from any source they could find. Non-battle casualties soared. For every man evacuated with a bullet wound from the fighting for Buna's coconut groves, several more were carried out on stretchers with high fevers, wasted muscles, and diarrhea that left them too weak to stand. Supplies of quinine were minimal. Atabrine, still unfamiliar and distrusted by many troops, was not yet universally enforced. On the Japanese side of the Buna-Gona pocket, conditions were catastrophic. Cut off by sea and air, Japanese defenders rationed their food to a few spoonfuls of rice a day. Malaria, beriberi, and dysentery hollowed them out. Corpses lay beside gun pits, emaciated to the bone. Japanese diaries recovered after the battle spoke of hunger, fever, and the slow realization that no relief would come. Many of those who finally collapsed did so without ever seeing the enemy's face. The Allied victory at Buna and Gona was costly and clumsy, but its medical lessons were seared into the command structure. In General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area headquarters, reports on sickness and malnutrition were treated almost as seriously as intelligence on Japanese troop movements. Surgeons and preventive medicine officers argued that without strict control of malaria and other diseases, any future offensive along the New Guinea coast would bog down under its own sickness. By mid-1943, their arguments had been heard. Malaria control teams became integral parts of planning for operations such as the landings at Nassau Bay, Lee, and the Huon Peninsula. Aircraft were allocated not just to move infantry and artillery, but to ferry in medical supplies and, crucially, to evacuate the worst cases. American and Australian units received more thorough briefings on foot care, water purification, and the absolute necessity of consistent atabrine use. Slowly, the data began to shift. In New Guinea and the Solomons, month by month, the ratio of sick to wounded changed. Disease rates remained high by peacetime standards, but compared to the early campaigns, they declined. More men remained effective longer. Those who fell ill had a better chance of treatment and a better chance of returning to duty. On the Japanese side, the curve bent the other way. The 18th Army in New Guinea, the garrisons left behind on bypass Solomons Islands, and outposts scattered through the Bismarck archipelago watched their strength drain away. American and Australian air and naval power cut their supply lines. Without regular food and medicine, they starved and sickened. In some sectors, post-war studies would show that well over half of Japanese fatalities stemmed from disease, exposure, and malnutrition rather than direct combat. By late 1943, the jungle that Japanese strategists had counted on as an ally was turning on them. For the Americans, those same swamps and ridges were still deadly, but no longer uncontrollable. A network of medic training, drug production, malaria control, and evacuation had grown from the painful experiences of Guadalcanal and Buna into a more cohesive system. The true measure of that transformation, however, would not be seen until the Great Island campaigns of 1944 and 1945, when American forces, now supported by a fully mature medical machine, assaulted some of the strongest positions Japan could build, and the survival rates of the wounded would reach figures no army in history had ever seen. In 1944, that system was tested on a scale no one on Guadalcanal could have imagined. Across the Central Pacific, American task forces moved toward the Marianas, Saipan, Tuna, and Guam stepping stones aimed directly at Japan's industrial heartland. Each island was a fortress of coral ridges, caves, and in places choking undergrowth and cane thickets. The heat was still oppressive, insects still swarmed, but the American assault forces that hit those beaches carried something new ashore with them, an expectation of organized, layered medical support. The plan began at the water's edge. During the Saipan landings in June 1944, assault battalions included UDMAN in the first waves. Corpsmen and medics rode in with the rifle companies, crouched in the same landing craft, their bags bulging with dressings, morphine, and now in many cases tiny glass vials of a new weapon, penicillin. Once the ramp slammed down and men stepped into the surf, anyone who fell had at least one trained pair of hands somewhere close. Behind the shifting line of foxholes and shell craters, battalion aid stations were laid out as soon as a patch of ground could be secured. Tents went up or ponchos were strung over poles. Tables were improvised from ammunition crates. Plasma bottles were unwrapped and hung. Surgeons, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, began the grim drill of triage, sorting the wounded into those who could wait, those who needed immediate attention, and those beyond saving. Evacuation from the beachhead was no longer an improvised afterthought. Amphibious tractors and duck amphibious trucks furrowed casualties back to the shoreline, where crews transferred stretchers to waiting boats. Hospital ships with their white hulls and red crosses lit at night lay offshore, their operating theaters already staffed and stocked. For less serious cases, transports and support vessels took on wounded, creating a moving chain of care stretching from the front line all the way to rear area general hospitals. In the Pacific jungles and hills, the environment still imposed its own pace. On Guam and in the high ground of northern Saipan, litter teams fought up and down steep slopes overgrown with scrub and woods. Rain turned trails into streams of mud. Japanese defenders used caves and ravines, forcing attackers into close combat among rocks and tangled vegetation. But the principle held: stabilize quickly, move rapidly, operate early, protect from infection. By this stage of the war, the arsenal at a surgeon's disposal had expanded beyond sulfa and plasma. Penicillin, produced in staggering quantities by American industry after 1943, flowed into the theater. First reserved for the most serious cases, it soon became standard for many penetrating wounds and infections. The combination of timely surgery, blood or plasma, sulfa, and penicillin slashed death rates from sepsis and post-operative infections. The same pattern repeated under even harsher conditions in the Palaus and the Philippines. On Palala, Marines fought through a furnace of coral and scrub where the heat index soared and water was scarce. The environment there was less jungle than blistering rock, but the same medical system had to function. Casualty collection points were marked, ambulance jeeps rattled back over shell-torn ground, and aid stations operated under relentless artillery. Disease remained a threat. Any lapse in water purification or sanitation could still trigger outbreaks. Yet compared to earlier years, serious non-battle illness was increasingly held in check. In Leyte and Luzon, where jungle and mountain combined with monsoon rains, army and guerrilla forces pushed through rice paddies and forest. Malaria lurked in the lowlands, and typhus, dengue, and dysentery still claimed their share. This time, however, Atabrine discipline and years of hard-won practice in field hygiene meant that American formations often remained operationally effective for far longer periods than their Japanese opponents. By now, the Japanese medical crisis was fully exposed. In the Philippines and on bypassed island garrisons from Truk to Rabaul, Japanese soldiers fought, or simply endured, under a crushing deficit of food and medicine. Interdicted shipping meant that even basic supplies could not get through. Medical officers who knew perfectly well how to treat malaria lacked drugs. Those who could diagnose beriberi or pellagra had no vitamin supplements to offer. Patterns repeated: thin figures, distended bellies, hollow-eyed men scraping by on grass, roots, and a few handfuls of rice. American medical statistics from this period began to reflect a stark reality. Across all theaters of World War II, roughly 96 to 97% of U.S. servicemen who reached a medical treatment facility after being wounded in action survived. In the Pacific, despite its jungles and swamps, the numbers were similar. A man who was hit but who could be evacuated to a battalion aid station, a field hospital, or a hospital ship had odds of living that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The cost in effort to reach that figure was immense and mostly invisible. Behind the frontline medic or corpsman were truck drivers hauling medical chests over jeep-rutted tracks, engineers laboring to drain mosquito-breeding swamps near camps, nurses tending rows of cots under canvas in rear area hospitals, pharmacists reconstituting dried plasma in shipboard labs, and pilots flying C-47s or seaplanes loaded with stretchers from rough jungle strips. The system was a web, and its strength lay in the fact that each thread held when pulled. Nowhere was this web stretched tighter than in the last great island battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima in early 1945 was more volcanic ash and rock than jungle, but the evacuation challenges were similar. The black sand made every step a strain. Litter bearers sank to their ankles as they carried the wounded from the front to beachhead aid stations. Japanese fire swept the open ground. Medics and corpsmen worked in bomb craters and behind sand berms, starting plasma, bandaging, injecting morphine. Navy surgeons aboard hospital ships operated nearly around the clock, their tables filled with men pulled from the island's torn landscape. On Okinawa, beginning in April 1945, the environment returned to something closer to the original Pacific jungle nightmare. Rain turned the island's clay to glue. Hills and ravines were choked with vegetation that concealed both American positions and Japanese caves. The campaign lasted months, and disease threatened to reclaim its old role. Typhus, malaria, and dysentery loomed. Yet the same disciplines applied. Latrine placement, water chlorination, atabrine issue, and mosquito control were enforced with a rigor born of years of bitter experience. Aid stations and evacuation routes were planned nearly as meticulously as artillery schedules. Even under kamikaze attack, hospital ships remained a lifeline offshore, taking aboard thousands of wounded. The Japanese defenders on Okinawa, caught in an endgame they could not win, had almost no comparable reserves of medical capacity. Civilian populations suffered terribly. Japanese soldiers ordered to hold to the last received limited treatment under cave hospitals lit by candles, with little anesthesia and few drugs. Disease and malnutrition ravaged them alongside the constant bombardment. By the time the fighting on Okinawa ended, the contrast between the two systems was complete. On one side, an army and navy that, whatever their other flaws, had made an extraordinary, sustained effort to preserve the lives of their wounded and sick, leveraging science and industry to wrestle with the jungle and the diseases it harbored. On the other, a military that had entered the war convinced that spirit and toughness could offset shortages in logistics and medicine, and that now saw its forces hollowed out by forces it could neither control nor adequately treat. In the end, Japanese hopes that the jungle and its fevers would break the American advance had been overturned. The same environment that had crippled early Allied operations had become, by 1944-45, a proving ground for a new age of battlefield medicine. An age in which a wounded man's chances depended less on where he fell, and more on the machinery of care that reached out to him. What that meant in human terms can only be understood by stepping back from the noise of battlefields and looking at the final reckoning. Who lived, who died, and how those unseen struggles against disease reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific. In the war's closing months, the reckoning unfolded not only on maps and surrender documents, but in ledgers and hospital records. Clerks and medical officers totaled the columns that had once seemed so abstract. Killed in action, died of wounds, died of disease, non-battle injury, evacuated sick, and returned to duty. Each number represented a body, a face, a small world of family and memory. Taken together, they revealed what the jungle and its diseases had truly done, and what modern medicine had managed to prevent. For the United States, the pattern was starkly different from older wars. In previous conflicts, disease had usually claimed more soldiers than weapons. In the American Civil War, roughly 2 out of every 3 deaths came from illness. In tropical colonial campaigns around the globe, armies had been gutted by fevers and dysentery long before they met in open battle. By 1945, the U.S. military's figures told another story. Across all theaters, more Americans had been killed in combat or died of wounds than had succumbed to disease and non-battle causes. In the Pacific, malaria, dysentery, typhus, and other infections still sickened hundreds of thousands, but relatively few died once they reached care. The old ratio had flipped. Behind that reversal lay the quiet power of the 97%. In official histories of the U.S. Army Medical Department, analysts later calculated that roughly 96 to 97 out of every 100 American soldiers and Marines who reached a properly equipped medical facility after being wounded in action survived. The percentage varied by theater and by type of wound, but the broad trend held, even in the Pacific's harshest environments. A man hit by shrapnel on Okinawa or Saipan who could be carried to a battalion aid station, and then on to a field hospital had far better odds than his father would have had in 1918, or his grandfather in 1863. Sulfa drugs, plasma and whole blood transfusions, penicillin and organized evacuation chains had turned what would once have been fatal injuries into survivable ones. The effect on combat power was profound. Every wounded man who lived and returned, if not to the front, then at least to productive life, represented training and experience preserved. Units that might once have dissolved under the combined weight of casualties and disease were instead able, in many cases, to rotate men back into line with scars but also with hard-earned knowledge. Divisions that had fought on Guadalcanal later fought on Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, Okinawa, carrying with them not just battle drills, but health discipline learned in the mud and fever swamps. On the Japanese side, the ledgers told a harsher tale. Precise numbers of disease and starvation deaths are difficult to untangle from combat losses, but post-war studies and unit histories make some things clear. In campaigns like New Guinea and the Solomons, and in the bypassed garrisons scattered across the Central and Southwest Pacific, illness and malnutrition killed Japanese soldiers on a scale that shocked even their own surviving officers. The 18th Army in New Guinea is a stark example. Of roughly 140,000 men committed over the course of the campaign, only a small fraction ever returned to Japan. Many died in battle, but many more succumbed to malaria, dysentery, pneumonia, and above all, starvation. Cut off by Allied control of the seas and skis, with inadequate medical stores and almost no way to evacuate the sick, they withered in place. On isolated islands, Rabaul Truck and dozens of smaller outposts, Japanese troops dug in and waited for attacks that never came. Instead, Allied strategy bypassed them, leaving them to rot slowly behind the front. Food supplies dwindled. Medical stocks ran out. Doctors and orderlies did what they could, but without drugs, without adequate calories, knowledge alone could not stop the slide. When the war ended, many of the survivors were skeletal, their bodies bearing the marks of diseases that, in American hospitals, had been tamed. These imbalances shaped the war long before the surrender. An army ravaged by disease, its ranks thinned by non-battle deaths and chronic illness, cannot maneuver with the same confidence as one that can keep its soldiers on their feet. Japanese formations that looked formidable on paper often arrived in battle already weakened, their average soldier underweight, anemic, vulnerable to shock and infection. American units, by contrast, increasingly arrived with higher baseline health, better vaccination coverage, and a functioning medical support net behind them. Strategically, this meant that the United States could sustain a tempo of operations in the Pacific that Japan simply could not match. Divisions cycled from one campaign to the next, battered but still cohesive, with many veterans stitched back together by surgeons and sent on. The U.S. could afford to commit fresh troops to major landings, knowing that medical services would reclaim a significant portion of the wounded. Japan, bleeding from both ends, combat and disease, was forced to hold increasingly important lines with formations that were in reality hollowed out. When Japanese staff officers after the war reviewed the collapse of their overseas armies, many pointed not only to industrial inferiority and air, sea losses, but to the slow, grinding attrition of sickness and hunger. The jungle that had been expected to be a silent ally had instead acted as an implacable, impartial judge of logistical and medical weakness. Yet the story did not end in 1945 with the closing of war diaries and the final casualty counts. The tools and ideas that had dragged that 97% of wounded Americans back from the brink did not disappear with the demobilization orders. They followed the veterans home, seeped into civilian hospitals, and began to change peacetime medicine just as surely as they had reshaped war. The war had turned the Pacific into a vast, brutal classroom for medicine. When the guns finally fell silent, the lessons did not stay in uniform. Factories that had learned to produce sulfa drugs and penicillin in wartime quantities shifted their focus to civilian markets. In 1941, penicillin had been a laboratory curiosity, produced in milligrams. By 1945, American industry was turning out enough to flood combat theaters. After the war, that same infrastructure supplied hospitals across the United States and soon much of the world. In crowded post-war cities, infections that would once have been death sentences began to yield to the same antibiotics that had saved men on Peleliu and Okinawa. Pneumonia, septic wounds, childbirth infections, casualties as old as humanity, were suddenly, often, survivable. What had started as a way to keep wounded soldiers alive in the jungle became a foundation of modern clinical practice. The techniques of blood banking and transfusion followed a similar path. In the Pacific, dried plasma and refrigerated whole blood had become standard tools in field surgery. Forward units collected blood from donors, labeled and stored it, and moved it along cold chains improvised through the tropics. After the war, those methods evolved into civilian blood banks, with established typing, storage, and distribution systems. Emergency rooms in peacetime cities could draw on the same principles that had sustained surgical tables under canvas on Leyte and Saipan. Even the more controversial tools carried their legacy. Insecticides used by malaria control units in the Pacific, especially DDT, introduced late in the war, were soon dispersed across civilian landscapes. They helped knock back malaria and other vector-borne diseases in parts of southern Europe, Asia, and the Americas, saving lives on a vast scale. Only later would the environmental costs become clear, prompting a reassessment and tighter controls. But in the immediate post-war years, the lessons seemed simple. War-borne technologies could be turned against some of humanity's oldest natural enemies. Institutionally, the impact of the Pacific medical system was just as deep. The Veterans Administration in the United States expanded to care for millions of returning servicemen, many bearing scars from the jungles and islands. Rehabilitation hospitals refined methods of physical therapy and prosthetics that had first been tested on battlefield amputees. Surgeons who had learned speed and precision under fire brought those skills into teaching hospitals. Generations of young doctors trained under men and women who had triaged under bombardment and operated in sweltering tents lit by dim bulbs. The idea that rapid, organized trauma care could change outcomes, rooted in those battalion aid stations and field hospitals, slowly migrated into civilian life. Helicopter evacuations in the Korean War, and later the development of dedicated trauma centers in major cities, owed something to the hard arithmetic first done in places like New Guinea and the Solomons. Time to treatment mattered more than almost anything else. On a broader stage, the war's tropical medicine experience fed into global health. Researchers who had sprayed swamps and studied mosquito habits in the Pacific returned to join or advise organizations like the World Health Organization. Post-war malaria campaigns drew directly on field data from wartime units. Vaccination programs, vector control, and public health education were built on a scaffolding that included not only laboratory science, but the practical lessons of keeping tens of thousands of men alive in disease-ridden environments. Japan, too, changed. The same nation whose wartime doctrine had often neglected logistics and medical support embraced, in its post-war reconstruction, a more systematic approach to public health. Nutrition programs, vaccination drives, and improved sanitation helped drive down the very diseases that had once ravaged its soldiers overseas. The self-defense forces that emerged under the post-war constitution developed medical and logistic structures that bore little resemblance to the lean, overstretched formations of the 1940s. Memory worked more quietly. For many American veterans, the figure that historians would later quote, the 97% survival rate for those who reached care, was not a statistic. It was a face on a litter, a groan in the dark, a flash of a corpsman's armband. Men who had been pulled out of muddy ravines in New Guinea or coral craters on Okinawa carried those moments with them into quiet lives in factories, farms, offices, and schools. The medics and corpsmen who had knelt over them often went on to medical school, nursing, or other forms of service. Others returned to ordinary jobs, their wartime skills fading into the background. Yet the structures they had been part of, the evacuation chains, the drug protocols, the hygiene routines, were absorbed into textbooks and training manuals. Young paramedics in modern cities, strapping tourniquets and inserting IV lines at the scene of car accidents, follow patterns first laid down when plasma bottles swung from rifles in a dripping Pacific night. For Japanese veterans, the memories were more bitter. Many recalled comrades lost not in the rush of battle, but in the slow dimming of sickness and hunger, far from any real hope of treatment. Their post-war testimonies, combined with the analyses of surviving officers, contributed to a broader reevaluation in Japan of how war should be waged, and at what human cost. The jungle, once imagined as a natural ally, became in hindsight a reminder of institutional failure and misplaced faith in sheer endurance. In the end, the Pacific campaigns left behind more than wrecked ships and sunken tanks. They left a changed understanding of what it meant to wage war in the modern age. That power was measured not only by shells fired or islands taken, but by how many of one's own could be pulled back from the edge of death. To grasp the full weight of that realization, it helps to return one last time to the individual soldier in the jungle, the man lying in the mud with a wound that would once have been fatal, and the medic who reaches him with a bag full of the distilled lessons of centuries. Picture that man in the jungle once more. He lies on his back, staring up through a lattice of leaves and rain. Somewhere an engine growls, a shell falls short, a shout rises and dies. His world has collapsed to the circle of sky above him and the pounding of his own blood. A generation earlier, his odds would have been poor. Infection, shock, and fever would have stalked him with almost certain patience. This time someone appears beside him. A medic's hands work in tight, efficient motions. Bandage, tourniquet, sulfa powder, the sting of a needle, the slow, cold trickle of plasma. Behind that moment is an entire civilization's decision, not made in a single day but grown over years, to treat science and care as weapons in their own right. Factories, laboratories, training grounds, hospital, ships, all of it converges in that small, muddy clearing. Across the line, another wounded man lies without that chain of help. His officers had trusted in the jungle, in climate and disease to wear the invader down. Instead, those same forces turned inward, punishing any army that could not master them. The fevers and rot that once seemed like allies became indifferent executioners. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. In a war defined by industrial killing, some of the most far-reaching innovations were dedicated to saving life. The same conflict that incinerated cities also normalized antibiotics, blood banking, and organized trauma care. The Pacific's jungles, imagined as natural fortresses, became laboratories in which the value of a soldier's life was measured by how much effort his country would expend to preserve it. The 97% figure, the survival rate for those who reached care, is more than a statistic. It is a statement of priorities. It tells us that, for one side at least, victory was tied to bringing men home alive, not merely to spending them. In the end, Japanese faith that disease and hardship would defeat America failed, not because the jungle was tamed, but because one nation chose to fight its invisible enemies with the same ferocity it brought to the visible ones. The legacy of that choice lives quietly on in antibiotics on a hospital shelf, in a paramedic's kit, in every life pulled back from the brink by hands that long ago learned their craft under a curtain of tropical